There is a specific quality of behavior that emerges when a person is managing a secret in a social environment. It is not the behavior most people imagine: the nervous glance, a visible sweat, the obvious tell of someone clearly coming apart under pressure. That version exists in film and in the most extreme circumstances of real life, but it is the exception rather than the rule. What actually happens when someone is hiding something is quieter, more structural, and in many ways more interesting. The person becomes a system under load. They are running to simultaneous processes: the normal social performance required by the interaction, and the continuous background work of concealment, and the cognitive and emotional cost of running both at once produces a specific and readable set of behavioral outputs that appear consistently enough across individuals and contexts to constitute a pattern. Professional interrogators, the ones operating at the highest level of the discipline, do not walk into a room looking for nervousness. Nervousness is unreliable. 'Tis produced by innocent people in high-stakes situations as readily as by guilty ones. And an interrogator who mistakes anxiety for deception will misread the room consistently. What experienced interrogators are actually reading for is something more specific. It's the behavioral signature of a person whose cognitive resources are being asymmetrically allocated. It's a person who is hiding something is not simply anxious. They are managing. And management, unlike anxiety, leaves a distinct and structured imprint on behavior that trained observation can identify and work with. This video is not about how to detect lying in the simple sense, the checklist approach that fills most treatments of this subject and produces results barely better than chance. It is about understanding the deeper model, the psychological architecture of concealment, how that architecture generates observable behavior, and how the interrogation framework uses that behavior not just to detect deception but to create the specific conditions under which concealment becomes unsustainable. The model is applicable far beyond formal interrogation contexts. It operates in every situation where the surface account and the actual situation have diverged, which is a description of a significant portion of all human interaction that carries real stakes. The foundation of the interrogation model is a concept that behavioral researchers and professional interrogators both arrive at from different directions: cognitive load asymmetry. When a person is telling the truth, the cognitive demands of the interaction are relatively straightforward. They are retrieving information, organizing it for communication, monitoring the social dynamics of the exchange, and managing the normal emotional content of the situation. These are demands the human cognitive system handles fluently under ordinary circumstances, which is why truthful accounts, even about complex events, have a specific quality of naturalness that is difficult to manufacture. When a person is concealing something, the cognitive architecture of the interaction changes fundamentally. They are now running an additional process that requires continuous active management, the concealment process. This process involves monitoring the emerging account for consistency with previous statements, tracking what the interrogator or interviewer appears to know versus what they appear not to know. It's constructing responses that are defensible under scrutiny rather than simply accurate, and suppressing the behavioral outputs that the emotional content of concealment naturally generates: the micro-expressions, the vocal changes, the postural shifts that the body produces in response to the internal state of hiding something significant. This suppression alone constitutes a substantial cognitive load. And cognitive load, when it exceeds a certain threshold, begins to produce behavioral degradation. Behavioral degradation under cognitive load does not look like falling apart. It looks like a subtle but consistent reduction in the fluency and naturalness of behavior. Speech becomes slightly more deliberate. Response latency increases, not dramatically, but measurably, particularly on questions that require the concealment process to generate a defensible answer, rather than simply retrieve an accurate one. Spontaneous elaboration decreases the natural tendency to add unrequested detail that characterizes truthful recall becomes less available when the cognitive resources that generate it are occupied elsewhere. The overall behavioral picture becomes slightly effortful in a way that reads, to a trained observer, less like a person recounting experience and more like a person constructing a position. The interrogation model organizes the behavioral outputs of concealment into 3 observation categories, each of which provides different information about the immersed person's psychological state and the specific nature of what is being managed. The first category is verbal behavior, not the content of what is said, but the structure of how it is said. Truthful accounts have a specific structural signature that is remarkably consistent across individuals and cultures. They are non-linear, they contain irrelevant detail. They include sensory information that serves no narrative purpose. They are organized around the experiential logic of how events were actually lived, rather than the narrative logic of how a story would be constructed for maximum coherence and impact. When people recount genuine experience, they tell it the way memory actually works associatively, with gaps, with tangents, with the spontaneous inclusion of peripheral details that a constructed account would edit out as unnecessary. Constructed accounts built to support a position rather than to convey experience, have a different structure. They tend toward linearity. They answer the question directly and efficiently. They lack the peripheral detail of genuine memory, because peripheral detail is cognitively expensive to generate and serves no strategic function. They resolve cleanly at points that genuine accounts leave unresolved, because the person constructing the account has unconsciously applied narrative logic rather than experiential logic. And they often contain what interrogators call structural overprecision, a level of specific detail in some areas that is inconsistent with the vagueness in adjacent areas, reflecting the asymmetric investment of cognitive resources in the parts of the account that require the most careful management. The second observation category is nonverbal behavior, but not in the oversimplified way most treatments of this subject approach it. The popular model of deception detection focuses on specific nonverbal tells, gaze aversion, touching the face, crossing the arms. This model has been largely discredited in serious behavioral research because these behaviors are culturally variable, individually variable, and produced by anxiety as readily as by deception. The interrogation model actually reads in nonverbal behavior is synchrony, the degree to which the verbal and nonverbal channels are producing coherent, matched outputs. When a person is telling the truth, their verbal and nonverbal behavior are generated by the same underlying state, idea congruent. The emotional content of what is being said matches the emotional content being expressed in the body, the face, and the voice. This congruence is automatic and effortless. It doesn't require management because both channels are drawing from the same source. When a person is concealing something, the verbal channel is being actively managed for content, while the nonverbal channel is being separately managed for suppression of the emotional outputs of concealment. These are 2 different management processes running on different timelines, and they produce what researchers call channel inconsistency, moments when the verbal content and the nonverbal expression are drawing from different sources, and the gap between them becomes briefly visible. Channel inconsistency is most readable in the micro-interval between a question being asked and the managed response beginning. The transitional moment before the concealment process has fully engaged. In that interval, the face and body produce outputs generated by the unmanaged emotional response to the question. These outputs are brief, often lasting less than 1/5 of a second, and they are suppressed almost immediately by the management process, but they are present, and their content, when read accurately, reflects the actual internal state that the constructed response is designed to conceal. The third observation category is what interrogators call behavioral discontinuity, the specific moments. When the person's behavior changes in ways that are not explained by the surface content of the interaction. These are the moments when a question that should be low stakes produces a high stakes behavioral response. When a topic that appears peripheral to the main subject of the conversation produces a sudden increase in management behavior. When the person's composure, which has been maintained fluently across a range of difficult questions, breaks unexpectedly in response to something that appears, on the surface, to be less threatening than what came before. Behavioral discontinuity is among the most valuable data points available to a skilled interrogator because it reveals the map of the person's psychological investment. It shows you where the load is actually concentrated, which is often not where you would have predicted it to be. A person hiding a significant fact does not necessarily produce the most intense behavioral response when that fact is most directly approached. They may produce the most intense response to a peripheral detail that is structurally connected to the concealed fact in ways that are not immediately obvious, because the peripheral detail, precisely because it is peripheral, is where the concealment architecture is thinnest and the underlying state is closest to the surface. Skilled interrogators do not move directly toward what they believe is being concealed. They map the behavioral discontinuities first, building a picture of where the psychological load is distributed, and use that map to identify the structural vulnerabilities in the account before applying any direct pressure to them. The active phase of the interrogation model, the phase that uses the behavioral map to create conditions under which concealment becomes unsustainable, operates through three primary mechanisms, each of which works on a different dimension of the concealment architecture. The first mechanism is evidence deployment strategy. The instinct of most people conducting an interrogation or difficult conversation is to reveal what they know as quickly as possible, to confront the person with the evidence and create the pressure of being caught. This instinct is almost always counterproductive. Premature evidence disclosure allows the person to organize their concealment around what has been revealed, to adjust the account to accommodate the known information while protecting what hasn't been surfaced yet. The evidence, deployed too early, becomes a gift. It tells the person exactly what they need to manage. Strategic evidence deployment withholds the most significant known information until the person has committed to an account that contradicts it. You allow the constructed account to develop, to elaborate, to establish specific, factual positions, and then you introduce evidence that makes those positions untenable. The person is now not just managing concealment, they are managing a contradiction between their stated account and known fact, which is a substantially higher cognitive load, and which produces the specific behavioral signature of a system under critical stress. Response latency increases sharply, elaboration collapses, and the concealment architecture begins to show its structural seams. The second mechanism is strategic use of silence and minimal response. The deliberate withholding of the social scaffolding that most people unconsciously depend on to regulate their behavior in difficult interactions. When an interrogator responds to a completed account with nothing, no affirmation, no follow-up questions, no visible signal of what the account has produced in them, the person who gave the account has no data point for calibration. They don't know if what they said was believed, if it contradicted something known, if a gap was detected. The ambiguity is total. And total ambiguity in a high-stakes situation produces the same behavioral outcome that ambiguity always produces: the drive toward resolution, which manifests as additional disclosure. The person fills the silence with more account. It's more account, generated under the pressure of unresolved ambiguity. It's less managed than the original, produced faster, with less strategic filtering. From a cognitive system that is now allocating resources to managing the anxiety of the silence, rather than to the quality control of the narrative. What emerges in the silence feeling is often the most structurally revealing content of the entire interaction, the place where the concealment architecture, under the dual load of maintaining the account and managing the uncertainty, produces its most visible gaps. The third mechanism is the assumption of knowledge, the behavioral projection of certainty about what the interrogator knows, regardless of what they actually know. This mechanism exploits a fundamental asymmetry in the concealment dynamic. The person hiding something does not know precisely what is known about what they are hiding. They have a model of the interrogator's knowledge, but it is an estimate, and estimates under pressure tend toward worst-case assumptions. If the interrogator projects, through behavioral certainty, the impression that what is being concealed is already substantially known, the person's cognitive model of the situation shifts. The question is no longer whether to protect the information. It may already be too late for that. The question becomes how to manage the damage. And damage management is a fundamentally different psychological operation than concealment, with a fundamentally different behavioral signature. The shift from concealment mode to damage management mode is visible when it occurs. The account changes character. The person begins to negotiate rather than deny, introducing qualifications, textualizations, partial admissions that are designed to reframe rather than to protect. The concealment architecture has not collapsed entirely, but it has changed function. It is no longer trying to maintain the fiction of the surface account. It is trying to control the narrative of what the revealed information means. And this shift, once it occurs, tells the skilled interrogator precisely where the most significant load in the original concealment was concentrated. The interrogation model is, at its deepest level, a model of cognitive and emotional sustainability. It's under the specific conditions of managing a significant gap between what is true and what is being presented as true. It is not primarily about catching people in lies. That is an output of the model, not its purpose. Its purpose is to understand the structure of human concealment well enough to recognize when it is operating, to map where its load is concentrated, and to create the conditions under which the gap between the presented account and the actual situation becomes too costly to maintain. This model is relevant in every context where that gap exists, which is not just interrogation rooms and high stakes. It's investigations, but the full range of human situations in which the surface account and the lived reality have diverged. It's professional context where the official story is not the real story. It's the relationship dynamic where something has shifted and the account being offered doesn't fully account for it. It's the social situation where behavior and explanation are not drawing from the same source. In all of these contexts, the same fundamental architecture is operating. The same cognitive load is being managed, the same behavioral outputs are being generated, and the same trained quality of observation that reads a person accurately in a formal interrogation reads them accurately everywhere else. What the model ultimately teaches is not suspicion, it is precision. The precision to see, without the distortion of assumption or the noise of your own reaction, what is actually happening in the behavioral layer of a human interaction, and to understand what that behavioral layer is telling you about the psychological reality it is running on top of.